Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sarah McIntyre, Acting Program Manager of Board and Strategic Services at Ottawa Public Library, and it's my great pleasure to introduce this evening's event. Kwe Kakina, hello. It's important to acknowledge that we are hosting this program this evening from the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. Many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples now live, work, and study in this territory. OPL is delighted to showcase authors and provide the opportunity for you to hear them talk about their work. This evening, we are pleased to have with us author Uzma Jalaluddin, who will read from and discuss her latest rom-com novel, Hana Khan Carries On, a Canadian bestseller. Hana Khan Carries On is Uzma's second novel, and I'm so excited to have heard that it's going to be adapted for film by Mindy Kaling and Amazon Studios. Inspired by the movie You've Got Mail and set in rival halal restaurants, Hana must learn to use her voice and draw on the strength of her community to decide what her future should be. Uzma Jalaluddin grew up in a suburb of Toronto, but her favorite place in the world is always the nearest library or bookstore. Growing up, Uzma had trouble finding novels featuring people who looked like her, and so she decided to write one herself. Her debut novel, Aisha at Last, is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, set in the Toronto Muslim community. Aisha at Last was longlisted for the Stephen Leacock Humor Award, listed for the Toronto Book Awards, was a Goodreads Choice Awards finalist, featured on the Today Show, was the Cosmopolitan UK Book of the Year, and Publishers Weekly's Best Book of 2019. Such an amazing achievement for a first novel. Uzma currently writes a culture and parenting column for the Toronto Star and has written for The Atlantic. She lives near Toronto with her husband and 2 sons, where she teaches high school. Hana Khan Carries On is available to borrow at OPL today. Again, thank you to everyone here this evening. And finally, it's now my pleasure to turn things over to tonight's special guest, Uzma.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. I really appreciate it. Hi, everyone. I'm Uzma Jalaluddin, and I am delighted to be speaking to you today. And I am just going to change this a little bit. Okay. I'm really delighted to be able to talk to you today. And I thought I would start off my session just by reading a little bit from my novel, Hana Khan Carries On. So this is writers always have like the speaking copy of their books. You can see that I have all the little stickies of my favorite passages. So I'm going to be reading you a part from Hana Khan Carries On towards the beginning of the book. And before I read this part, I just want to, for those of you who are not familiar with the book, just speak a little bit about some of the characters so you kind of can orient yourself in the story. Hana is the main character. She's 24 years old. She is the daughter of South Asian immigrants. Her mother runs an Indian restaurant in Scarborough, which is an East End suburb of Toronto. It's a very diverse suburb. Her mother's restaurant has been struggling lately. They're having trouble finding people who are still interested in eating the traditional foods that she makes. In addition, Hana also interns at a radio station called Radio Toronto, and she interns with her fellow intern whose name is Thomas Matthews. And her and Thomas are both the children of Indian immigrants. And they sort of have a competitive, contentious relationship. In the excerpt that I'll be reading on page 61, Thomas has basically sprung this idea on Hana of doing a podcast show together for the radio station. And the show would basically revolve around educating their listeners on what it's like to be a racialized person. And Hana, who really wants to write and produce and just work on radio shows that are more mainstream is not happy about this idea. And so Thomas reminds her about sort of one of the major themes of this book, which is the burden of representation that is often the case for a lot of marginalized readers. I'm timing myself, so I tend to ramble, so I'm going to stop and make sure that I don't read too much. Okay, so this is I'm reading from page 61 of Hannah Khan Carries On. One more thing. The whole premise of this book is that it is a You've Got Mail retelling. So for those of you who are familiar with the movie, You've Got Mail starring Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, basically it's Hannah Khan Carries On is a You've Got Mail retelling. So Hannah throughout the entire book has a long-running conversation and long-running friendship with someone whose username is Stanley P. She produces these podcast episodes that she uploads online. Stanley P is one of the very first listeners, and they strike up a very fast friendship. So at some points in this passage, she'll be speaking to Stanley P via text. So she'll be texting him. All right, here we go. Working on a show, any show, was all I had ever wanted to do. So far, all Thomas and I had done in our internship was file, photocopy, archive, and research other people's stories. The first time I had done a job that excited me had been the day before, when Marissa, my boss, had let me co-produce Big J's show. Hosting a show about culture and religion was not what I wanted to do. The worst part is, Thomas knew how I felt. We had talked about it before. Who was going to tell the stories only we know? We're South Asian, we're second-generation immigrants, you're Indian Muslim, and I'm Indian Christian. Both minorities within minority communities. We have things to say and diverse perspectives that people would love to hear, he had argued. Is that your tagline? I'm brown, I'm interesting, listen to me. The minute I start writing stories about the Muslim or Desi community, I'll be put in a box, and that will be all I'll ever do or ever be known for. I'm too young and interesting to be the exotic brown person expert for the next 30 years, I argued back. Hannah, you could be the person who changes people's minds about Muslims, Thomas would counter. That comment always made me laugh. The bigots are never going to listen to me, and everyone else already likes me because as an Indian Canadian, I stand for samosas and maple syrup. I'm good. The truth was, Thomas had less to lose. When a man talks about politics and religion next to a brown-skinned woman who wears hijab, guess who attracts all the misogynist trolls and violent death threats? I come by my cowardice honestly, through the experience of those braver than myself. I had no desire to be a social justice martyr. I wanted to follow my instincts and my own interests, not use my faith and skin color to provide teachable moments to listeners on demand. Thomas knew how I felt. He had pitched his stupid idea anyway. He really was the worst. I took out my phone and messaged Stanley P. Anna, BGR, how good of an advice giver are you? Stanley P. answered immediately. I am regularly consulted by sitting monarchs, regents, prime ministers, and benevolent dictators. Celebrities have me on speed dial. Hannah, not sure I can afford your consultation fee. Stanley, we can work out a payment plan. What troubles you? Anna, would you accept a job that helped your career if you had to sell out on the reasons you got into the field in the first place? Stanley, I take it the world of supreme Etsy overlord is more fraught than you first thought. Ah, the naivete of the untested. Anna, I'm serious. What would you do if, for example, the only opportunity you had to get a good job was to do work that didn't interest you and might cause harm to people like you? And don't tell me I'm being dramatic. Stanley, I like dramatic people. They make me feel so grounded. Anna, not helping. Stanley, here's what I think. In business, you always have to think about costs and benefits. What are the benefits you would gain versus the upfront costs of taking this opportunity? Answer 2 questions. Number 1, will your employer continue on this path with or without you? And number 2, is there a chance that your participation means the job could be steered in a better direction? Anna, yes and maybe? Stanley, then the cost of leaving is having no input into any of the gains of staying and losing any chance you have of being heard. I put my phone away. I had been hoping Stanley would advise me to run for the hills. Instead, he was making me reconsider. I didn't like it. My radio partner found me on the steps outside the station. He took a seat a few feet away from me and stared down at his shiny black loafers. Marissa thinks this is a way to keep both of us employed after the internship is over. She thinks the idea has real potential, he said quietly. I didn't even look at him. This isn't the story I want to tell. Thomas sighed. Do you want to get stuck being the most junior employee at every broadcaster you ever work for? Because you and we don't have contacts in this industry. There's no one we can call for help who can give us any advantage. We're pioneers, paving the way for the kids coming up behind us. And that means we're entirely on our own. You know, we're already swimming against the desi parent, socially acceptable career current by not studying something traditional like medicine, engineering, accounting, or law. We need to use whatever we can to get ahead. And if that means leveraging our culture and faith to tell the stories we know better than anyone else, that's a win on two levels. This is your duty, your dharma. Thomas was right. We had to start somewhere. Thomas pumped his fist in the air when I told him I would help pitch his stupid idea to Nathan Davis. If we're going to do this, we're doing it my way, I told him. That means we're not going to talk about samosas, henna, butter chicken, or terrorists on the show. We're going to talk about real issues, not broad stereotypes or overplayed narratives. No honor killings, no bindis, no Bollywood, no discussions about radicalization. Whatever you want, Hannah, Thomas said. This is our show. We're in this together. Minority Alliance activated. So I jumped a little bit, but the crux of this is one of the main issues that I wanted to talk about in Hannah Khan Carries On, which is this idea that as a young person, Hannah is about 24 years old when the book takes place, and she's really stuck. Like, she doesn't really know what she wants to do with her life. She's a little bit confused about the direction that she wants her future to take. She knows that she wants to do big things, and yet she feels kind of held back from doing those things because of the circumstances that she lives in. So this is the excerpt. I'm going to come back to some of these themes in a little bit. And I think I'm going to just spend a little bit of time talking about my writing journey, as well as why I chose to write as my second novel, a book that was inspired by a 1990s rom-com. So this book was actually, I started writing this book in 2017. It's sort of an interesting story. I had written my first novel, Aisha at Last. You can see the cover behind me. I started writing it in 2010, so a very long time ago. And it took me a really long time to finish the book because I was very stubborn. I didn't want to stop. Basically didn't want to stop writing it. Sorry, I keep seeing myself, and this is just weird. So I'm just going to try to, I don't know if I can change the view for this. All I see is my own face, which is very disconcerting. So I'm just going into the view here to see if I can look at someone other than myself. Oh, you know what? I am going to see if I can just go into the speaker view. It's like I'm talking to a mirror image of myself, which is very strange. Okay, that's better. I just minimized the window. All right, so I started writing this book in 2017, as I said, and it was the second book that I wrote, and there's this weird alchemy that happens with your second book, because the first book is something that you spend a lot of time writing, right? You might spend years. Some people spend decades writing that first book, and they have all of this time to finesse it. But when my first book came out, when my first book was finished, I had this itching need and desire to jump into a second project, but I didn't know what to write. And at the time, when I started writing Hannah Khan Carries On, I hadn't even sold my first book. I had basically decided that while I was waiting to see what would happen with my first book, whether it would be accepted by a publishing house, whether it would get published, whether it would actually turn into an actual book that people could buy or take out from the library, one of the advice that's given to writers is to basically write your second book while you're waiting to see what happens with your first book. And so that's what I did. I started writing my second book and I didn't know what to write about. I had been singularly focused on my first novel, Aisha at Last, for so long that I didn't know how to sort of go about and work on my second book. I was out for dinner with my husband, and this was in spring of 2017. We decided to go to one of the popular halal restaurants that kind of are all over the GTA, and I know they're in Ottawa as well. I like some of the halal places in Ottawa, especially the shawarma joints. So this particular place serves like American style food, specifically things like steaks and ribs and milkshakes and burgers and pasta dishes, like American style, kind of quasi-Italian. And I remember looking around and remarking to my husband that, when we were growing up, this level of variety of halal food simply wasn't available. So we both grew up in the 80s and 90s in the GTA. And if we wanted, for instance, like a burger, there was no such thing as a halal burger. You had to go home, buy the halal chuck meat and make it yourself at home. If you wanted like fried chicken, you had to go home and make it yourself. Like everything was homemade. I never had a burger at McDonald's, for instance. Anytime that I went to McDonald's, I was getting the ice cream or the French fries and probably not even that. And so I was remarking to my husband how things have changed so much in the intervening decades, so much so that my children, who are now teenagers, have grown up in a city where they can get halal anything, basically, relatively close by. So if they wanted a halal pepperoni on their pizza, you can go and order that from the corner store, which serves halal pizza. If you want halal burgers, that's available too. And the germ of an idea jumped into my mind. I just thought, isn't it interesting the way that food is oftentimes a stand-in for the way that communities and successive waves of immigration changes the landscape of the city. And I thought that would be because my books are always not just about, they're not just a romance, they're not just, and there's nothing wrong with a book that is only that, but they tend to kind of dig into other issues of identity and self-expression. So I thought, okay, I think I have something here. And I'm a huge fan of 1990s rom-coms. So I've watched all of them. And whenever Netflix recommends a new one to me, I'm like, I already saw that. And I particularly love the Meg Ryan genre. So all of her movies are super fun. Fight me on this. I love all of her movies. And I particularly love You've Got Mail. For those of you who have read my first novel or who've heard of my first novel, Aisha at Last, my first book is actually a retelling of Pride and Prejudice. And I found out after Hannah Khan Carries On was published that You've Got Mail, the movie, was inspired by Pride and Prejudice. So I guess I've just written two versions of Pride and Prejudice, but that's neither here nor there. I took the idea of You've Got Mail as sort of a hook, and I brought it into the world of restaurants, and I set it in the same neighborhood as Aisha at Last was set in, because I think I'm still not done with writing about Scarborough and my experiences growing up in Scarborough. And that's how Hannah Khan Carries On sort of came about. It's going to take some. I can see Miranda has some questions. Thank you so much. And I should say, if any of you people in the audience have any questions for me, because this is an unmoderated session, if you don't want to hear me ramble for the next 40 minutes, please do ask me questions. Ask me anything, as the kids say, and I will answer or try to answer. So that's how I started writing Hannah Khan Carries On, and I quickly ran into a lot of problems because I didn't know how to structure it. You've Got Mail is basically a movie that takes place in the present time, but then it also uses the medium of, at the time, the revolutionary idea of email or chat rooms. Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks characters. I think the movie's streaming on Netflix. If you want to watch it, it was, or maybe it still is. They basically they start off talking in chat rooms, and then they send emails to each other, which is super quaint. And in book form, this is called an epistolatory book. So it's a book where a lot of the book is kind of, the action takes place, but then you have other sections of the book that are basically letters back and forth between characters, which is really fun to read. And I was wondering what is the vehicle that I'm going to use? Because I know that the whole setup is both of my main two characters, Hannah and Aiden, are going to own or be in the business. Hannah's mother it's actually her restaurant, but it's the family business. They're going to have rival restaurants. Okay, so I knew that was happening in the foreground, but in the background, what is the vehicle with which these two main characters are going to be able to communicate and fall in love and realize that they have feelings for each other? And I went through many different iterations of this. I settled on having the main characters communicate via a podcast. So Hannah has a podcast, as I mentioned at the top of this presentation, and she basically has called her podcast Anna's Brown Girl Rambles, and it's an anonymous podcast where she's almost using it like a diary, where she just talks about her life as a young South Asian Muslim woman living in Toronto, and then shares her ideas and what she's going through with the people who may or may not be listening. And Stanley P. Ends up being one of her very first listeners, and they become very good friends. So it took me a really long time to come upon that. And one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that there was a different version of Hannah Khan Carries On. So here's a secret for everyone who's listening, that never made it past my agent, because she read it and she was like, no, this doesn't work. Where instead of the two characters communicating and getting to know each other over the course of a podcast, they were actually both playing an online video game. And that's how they were communicating with each other. So I have an entire version of this book where the main characters, where I created an online video gaming world, sort of like a League of Legends type of thing, with its own subplot and all of this kind of thing, that will never see the light of day. So this would go into the director's cut of any book, and any kind of detail about Hannah Khan Carries On. I should probably tell the movie people if they want to use that as an example, as an idea. The book took me about 2 years to write, which is really fast for me because my first book, Aisha at Last, took 8 years. And it was really hard to write in such a short amount of time. I'm currently working on my third book, and my third book, I'm going to have even less time. I'm hoping to finish it by the spring. And then hand it over to my editor. So we'll have written that book within a year, which is really, really short time for me. There's a thing called the second book slump, which is a real thing. And what it means is that you have so much time to write your first book, but by the time you come around to writing your second book, there's a lot of doubt that sets in, and there's a lot of can I do this again? Maybe the first time was a fluke. So I was, just like every other writer, very much worried about how people would greet my second book. And I think that's one of the reasons why, and I see, Miranda, you don't want any spoilers, but there's a lot that happens in this book. So there's the whole, Stanley and Anna have this podcast relationship. Hannah has her own life on the Golden Crescent. She meets, lots of different characters. On the Golden Crescent, she has family flying in from India who basically, upturn her life in a lot of different ways. Her mother is undergoing extreme financial struggles, and then her father is very sick because he was injured in an accident a while ago, which has completely altered their entire family life. And the other thing that's happening is the creeping forces of gentrification. So in Scarborough, the neighborhood where they live in is basically changing because they're this very immigrant heavy neighborhood is evolving as the property prices go up, which is something that's definitely happening in Toronto right now. And I threw everything into it because I was like, I'm writing a second book. I want this to be a really solid sophomore effort. And that's why there's so much going on. in the book, but I'm really proud and happy of the way that it turned out. I love both my books, and I hope I'll love my third book. But yeah, writing a book is really hard. Okay, I'm going to pause here and answer some of the questions. I can see that they are here. I guess I'll full screen and start staring at my face again. Okay. So the first question, would love to hear how you juggled writing, family, and a full-time job. I get this question all the time. So how do I juggle writing, family, and a full-time job? First of all, I am a high school teacher. I've been teaching since 2000, and I always forget. I think it's 2003. Yeah, I think I started in September 2003. So I've been teaching for a really long time. I'm a very experienced teacher, but even the most experienced teacher can't get away from lesson planning and from marking and all of this kind of thing. In addition, I write a column for the Toronto Star that I've written since 2015. And it comes out every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks I have an essay due, and then I write books on top of that. I recently wrote a play, and I want to dabble in basically every single form of writing before I'm done. I don't know how I juggle it all. Teaching, I got to be honest, I would probably be a more prolific writer if I wasn't a teacher. But life is life, and bills have to be paid. And I also happen to love my job as a teacher, so I'm not ready to give that up just yet. One thing that really helps me is, you can't see this, but in my office, I have like a paper calendar just above my computer over here, and I block off time. I also have my teacher friends and I just bought one of these agendas. It's a 2021 teacher lesson planner, but it's also got like lots of space for, a weekly calendar. And I block off time. So this week, for instance, I don't have a column due for the Toronto Star. So I've been working on my third novel, and I'm trying to work on getting pages written. So I'll give myself a goal. I'll say, okay, I want to write about 5,000 words this week. And it's not a lot of words, but I need to make sure that I get those 5,000 words written. Sometimes I'll write after dinner for an hour or two. Sometimes I'll wake up really early in the morning at 5 or 6 a.m. And just before I head to work, maybe I'll write for 45 minutes or so. And then weekends, of course, are key because I'm off. I'm not teaching on the weekends. For instance, my job over the summer vacation was to work as hard as I could on my third book. So I find, my friend calls it micro calendaring. So basically taking your calendar on a week-to-week basis, sometimes on a daily basis, and then finding those slices of time to work on something with a very focused intensity. So next week, I know I have a Toronto Star column due by Friday. So I'll make sure that I start that on Monday, and I'll work on it until it's done. And it might take me about 2 days. I also have, as a teacher, I also have a lot of marking and planning to do. So I think I've become accustomed to just constantly working. That's really the short form. I don't have a lot of free time, but I'm trying to carve out time because, of course, it's also important to recharge and relax, exercise and do things like that. Okay, the style of an electronic diary shared with the reader or viewer reminds me of the Lizzie Bennet Diaries vlog. I have heard of it. Were you at all inspired by that? I wasn't. I didn't finish it. I watched it. I think it came out about 10 years ago, right? I remember it was really popular, the Lizzie Bennet Diaries. I think just in general, what I was actually inspired by was podcasts. I love podcasts. I listen to podcasts all the time, whether I'm cooking or I'm driving or if I'm taking a walk, I always listen to a podcast. Some of my favorite podcasts are either on NPR or they're on Gimlet Media. I listen to them on my Spotify app. Code Switch is a great one. Planet Money, The Indicator. I really like Script Notes, Revisionist History. Dolly Parton's America was great. I really enjoyed the Serial series. So many podcasts. So that's really what I was inspired by. That type of This American Life, of course, was the first one that I listened to, that type of storytelling, I find it so interesting. You could just be going about your everyday, and yet you're listening to, in your ears, you're having this very intimate storytelling experience. So not so much from the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, which were fantastic, but I got to be honest, I only watched a couple episodes of those, but more by podcasts. Okay. All right, so Miranda says, I admired your approach to explaining cultural specific terms in the narrative. Did you learn that before first sale or in discussion with professional editor? Thank you, Miranda. My approach to explaining culturally specific terms in the narrative. Okay, so I think what Miranda's referring to is, how do I explain things like food preferences, or even like faith-based practices like Jummah is Friday prayer, and sort of things like that. Thank you so much. I didn't consult with the professional editor until I sold my book, and then I had my book editor, take a look at that. I think what happened with Aisha at Last in particular, and the practice continued with Hannah Khan Carries On, is that I'm just a drafter. I write a lot of drafts. My first draft is no one ever sees it. I'm the only person who sees my first draft. And because I write so many drafts, I feel like with Aisha at Last in particular, because the book took me so long, I evolved in my writing process through the drafting process. So in earlier drafts of Aisha at Last, I had, words like Jummah or Nikah, which is the Muslim wedding ceremony, kind of in italics. And then at the end of the book, I had like a big glossary of terms where I defined everything. And then in later drafts, I was like, Nikah is something that a lot of people know about. And even if they don't, they can just Google it. It's a really well-known term. And I removed the glossary, and I even removed a lot of the over explanation, because as a writer who comes from a diverse background, like as a Muslim South Asian woman, I'm writing a story for the mainstream audience, but I don't want to feel like I'm sort of talking down to the Muslims who kind of are like getting on my jokes on a different level, or who understand this experience because they're South Asian on a different level than, say, like an Arab reader would. I don't want to talk down to them. So I don't want to over explain too much, but I need to add a little bit of explanation. And the only, I'm glad that it came across so naturally. It really was just practice. And, I would give it to my writer friends and say, does this work? And they would read it and give me feedback. That's how I improved. Okay, so Miranda asks, wondered if the white reviewers compare it to white classics. Is it a spoiler or a good way to draw in white readers, or both? If the white readers compare it to white classics, is a spoiler or a good way to draw in white readers, or both? I don't really think of my readers in terms of being white or not, being mainstream or not mainstream, or white or not white. I think from a marketing perspective, it's always good to kind of have that one sentence, like in the business, we call it a log line, right? Like it's a little sentence that's the hook of the book. Maybe a sentence or two, like, what is this book about, right? So, like Harry Potter is about a young boy who finds out that he's a wizard, and you're immediately like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what that's about. I mean, Gone Girl is about this dysfunctional relationship, and you don't really know who's the villain and who's the hero. It's kind of interesting. And so with Aisha at Last, I knew that I needed some kind of a hook. And I'm a huge fan of Jane Austen. So I said, I'm going to write a Muslim Pride and Prejudice set in Toronto. That's it. It's a one sentence hook. And oftentimes sentences like that, they don't get at the complexity of the plot, because of course a book is 300, 400, 500 pages long. There's so much more is going on than just that one little log line. But you need to have that hook to grab people's attention. So when I say that Hannah Khan Carries On is You've Got Mail set in rival halal restaurants, even before I finished writing the book. And when I told my editor that, when I tell my friends, when I would tell other writers, they instantly got what I was trying to do. So it's more of a marketing thing than anything else. But of course, Hannah Khan Carries On is actually about so much more than the issues that were covered in You've Got Mail. Yeah. So Miranda, I kind of answered your question about the podcasting was not the original idea. It was online video games. I started writing Hannah Khan Carries On in 2017, not in 2010. Aisha at Last, my first book back there, I wrote that in 2010. Okay. All right. So Tammy, Miranda, I'm going to come back to some of your questions. Tammy asks, how did the book land in Mindy Kaling's hands? I want to answer this first because I think this is a fun question. Mindy Kaling. So I have a film agent, and my first novel has also been optioned. Aisha at Last was optioned by Pascal Pictures, Amy Pascal. Amy Pascal is the producer behind the Spider-Man movies, which is very exciting. So she is the person behind like Into the Spider-Verse and all of the Spider-Man movies. So she really liked Aisha at Last and she optioned it. And because she optioned it, I needed a film agent. My film agent is in New York. He's fantastic. And a lot of authors who are published do have film agents. So when my second book was coming out, he knew that because there had been so much interest in my first novel, that my second novel would probably be of interest to producers in Hollywood. I didn't know this, but right now romantic comedies are very popular in Hollywood because, you know, they have seasons too, right? They have seasons where they're, you know, everyone really wants like the domestic thriller or the psychological thriller or the dystopian. So now everybody is really interested in romantic comedies, probably because the world is such a trash fire. And so when, even before publication of Hannah Khan Carries On, the book was published in April. When I was done writing it, I gave it to my film agent and he started shopping it around. So Mindy's people were interested in it, and they also knew the person, a screenwriter who was also interested in adapting it, and she's a Muslim LA-based screenwriter. So both of them together basically worked with my agent and optioned the book. And hopefully it'll be made into a movie under Mindy Kaling's production company, Kaling International. And Amazon Studios has also signed on to basically, you know, be the distributor and put together the movie as well. So I'm really excited with the direction of this. I'm a huge fan of Mindy Kaling's, and when this deal came about, I had to be very quiet about it for a very long time. But when the deal came about, you know, it's always a matter of, you know, my agent is amazing. He has the right contacts, but it's also about like just, you know, books sort of hitting at the right time and appealing to the right person. Are you going to get to weigh in on the screenwriting at all since you want to do all the sorts of writing? Not for Hannah Khan Carries On. In the future, who knows? But I just optioned this outright. They've already hired a screenwriter. Like I said, she's fantastic. I'm going to get, I think, creative consultant credit. If hopefully, fingers crossed, the movie actually gets made. And by that, I think, you know, if they have any questions about South Asian culture, Muslim faith, or just like life in Toronto, if they choose to keep it set in Toronto, they will come to me. So that's basically the extent of my involvement, which I'm fine with because right now I have too many deadlines. I have too many things that I need to sort of work on. Okay, so I'm going back to some of the other questions. Okay, so Miranda asked, can you speak about your experience getting your first book sold? So the process of traditional publication, if any of you are interested in getting any of your books sold through a traditional publisher, I think there's about 4 or 5 big publishers. You've probably heard of them. My publisher is HarperCollins. My US publisher is Penguin Random House. There's Simon & Schuster that was just bought by Penguin Random House. There's Hachette, and there's Macmillan. And these are the big publishers. And then, of course, there are smaller publishers as well. They all have lots of imprints. In order to approach the big publishers, you need a literary agent. So that's someone who is going to take you on as a client, who's going to help mold your career and help you come up with ideas for stories, just basically acts in your best interest. Once you've attracted the interest of a literary agent, they will help you try to sell the book. Now, the key is finding a literary agent. It's really hard. You have to have, especially as a new writer, you have to have a completely finished manuscript, something that's polished and is ready for the market. And then you basically have to try to find a literary agent who represents your genre and who also is taking clients and wants to represent you. So that's a little bit difficult. there's a whole process for that. And if you're interested, I would, advise you to Google. You can also go to my website, uzmajalaluddin.com. Under the, FAQs, I have a whole instructions on, how I got my literary agent. And so I was lucky enough to work with a literary agent. She's American. She gave me some really good feedback. I worked on the book a little bit with her, and she basically compiled a submission list and tried to approach editors, saying, basically pitching my book to them. And I was very fortunate, very, very fortunate that my editor at HarperCollins Canada, they were the first ones to kind of offer for the book. And they've been fantastic to work with. Thereafter, we sold the rights to the United States through Penguin Random House, and we also sold the European rights, specifically in the UK, to Atlantic Books. Okay, so Miranda asks, was I open to a big change as a video game or podcast? So my editor didn't have anything to say about the video game. That was a suggestion from my agent. I gave her my second book, and she advised that I throw away the video game component. I feel a lot of ownership over my stories, but I'm always open to suggestions, and I will always listen to the people in my life who I know understand what I'm trying to do. And my agent had a very good suggestion. It was really hard because I had to basically throw out a third of the book and rewrite it. But I knew that she was right because she brought up some really valid points. So I'm so glad I listened to her, and I decided to turn the interaction between Hannah and Stanley P into a podcast as opposed to a video game. And a lot of that is just instinctive. Like as a writer, because I've done so much writing, I know what my book needs, and I have to listen to the book. I have to listen to good advice. I can say no and I can push back, but I have to realize that these are professionals who want the book to sell, want the book to do well. And as much as my opinion counts, I need to listen to the people in my corner. Okay. Do you do entire book once before polishing, or do you jump back and forth? So everyone has their own different process. Some people even write completely out of order. Like they'll write the beginning and then they'll write the end, and they'll go to like somewhere in the middle and they'll go back to the beginning. I am a very plotting kind of writer. I believe that you should finish your first draft fast. Like Stephen King advised in his fantastic book on writing, which you could borrow from the library. It's a really great book. He said you should write a draft within a season. So within 3 months, you should try to finish your draft. I'm not that fast, but I certainly go from the very beginning to the very end. And then I let the book rest. So I'll write the entire draft. It might take me 6 months, but I'll write the entire draft, and then I'll let it rest for a month or two, and I'll come back to it with fresh eyes. And then I have a whole very complicated revision process, and everyone revises in a different way. But that's the way that I do it. Okay. Cooking hands. Oh, Mystic Cooking Hands. Okay, I think that's a reference to Hat Gamaza, which is a term that Hannah uses to describe her mother's cooking ability. She calls a Hat Gamaza is like a Hatki Maza, I should say. It's an Urdu phrase that when you say that someone has like magical cooking hands, like they have like abilities in their hands. Yeah. So what is coming next? Thank you for asking. I was actually working on it earlier today. I'm about 2/3 of the way done writing the first draft of my third book, which is a very exciting thing to be able to say that I'm working on my third book. It's kind of awesome. Sorry, I'm going to have some water. I've been talking for 45 minutes. So my third book is kind of an homage to one of my favorite Jane Austen novels, which is Persuasion. And it's sort of also a little bit of Shakespeare. And I'm saying this again, knowing that my book is loosely inspired by those two books, but it really does stand on its own. It is about a main character named Nada Sayed, Nada, Nada Sayed. And she also lives in the Golden Crescent neighborhood of Hannah Khan Carries On, so that same sort of diverse Scarborough neighborhood. I think these three books are going to be like my Toronto trilogy, these three romantic comedies about Muslim main characters in Toronto. And except the action in this third book, a lot of the story takes place in this event that used to happen pre-COVID in Toronto, where you have I need to plug in my computer. There was a massive Muslim conference that used to take place in Toronto, where Muslims from all over Canada were basically there's like a huge bazaar where you could buy lots of different products. It was a big socializing scene. There were a lot of like people who kind of like met their partners at this conference. They went to religious lectures, or they went and they networked and they socialized. It was a 3-day conference that took place. Of course, pre-COVID, now everything is virtual. And I grew up attending conferences like this, and I thought it would be so fun to sort of set a book in this extremely, short amount of time in this particular space. So that's what my third book is about right now. And it's really, it's fun. I love drafting. I love the first draft, because after that, when you start revising, then it's a lot of work. Then it's like, okay, rip it open and then expose the guts and then start to play around with it and fix everything. But the first draft is just the absolute sincere type of creation. I'm making up the story as I go along. Even though I am an outliner, I have a full outline that I'm following, and yet every dialogue, every little bit of interaction is completely brand new to me. So it's really fun. Okay, so another question: do I have a community of writers? I do have. I did have friends who were writers. Not a lot. I had about 2, so we were a little trio of writers. One of whom was published before when I met her, and the other one was not. So we became really good friends. We're still friends and we're still supportive of each other. But having writer friends is incredibly important. It was really important for me. And I even took a class, a novel writing class. It was about a week long, so I don't know how much work, how much it actually helped me, but I thought I should take one, and I did. But to be honest, I'd basically written my book even before I took that class. But community is so incredibly important. I'm active on Twitter, I'm active on Instagram, and on Twitter, I follow a lot of writers. I read a lot of books about writing. I'm always, you can't really see, but in the shelf behind me, I have a lot of craft books. I'm always trying to improve my craft and think about writing and think about just the craft of writing all the time. And every time I finish a draft, I have a couple of trusted people that I give the draft to. And when they read it and they tell me what they think, I write down all of their ideas. And if I agree with their suggestions, I do implement them as well. Okay, so what's your advice to a fellow ESL teacher who is interested in writing a novel? What are some pathways in writing where contemporary Muslim identity can be authentically explored? Thank you. I'm not an ESL teacher, but I do teach English. As I'm one of those people who has 2 teachables. I teach English and I also teach science. But you're a fellow teacher who's interested in writing, which is fantastic. So some pathways in writing, who's interested in writing a novel, I would say the first thing that you should do is to think about what idea you want to get across. What is it about this idea that you think is sticky? And sticky in the sense that when you start writing a book, you're basically entering into a relationship with an idea. And that relationship, that idea has to be interesting enough to keep your attention for the long haul. I knew when I was writing Hannah Khan Carries On, I really wanted to explore community, family, and the way that those things intersect in a diverse neighborhood. That's really what I was talking about, as well as family responsibility. So make sure that your idea is interesting to you, it's fascinating to you. You could talk about it and think about it for a very, very long time. And then after that, when I first started writing, I read a lot of craft books. So I mentioned Stephen King's On Writing. Another one that gets thrown out a lot is called Bird by Bird by, who is it? It's right behind me. Okay, I'm sorry. Maybe the good people at the Ottawa Public. Oh, Anne Lamott. Thank you so much. Yeah, so Anne Lamott wrote a fantastic book called Bird by Bird. Anne Patchett wrote The Getaway Car, was a nice essay in there about writing. Elizabeth George wrote a fantastic book called Write On. and she has another one as well. I read Aristotle's The Poetics recently. That was really interesting. Just craft books. And I did a lot of online research as well. And it just sort of became a part of my identity. Like I was really interested, both from an education point of view, but also from a practical point of view as a writer, in just exploring how I can make my art and my craft better. So that would be another suggestion. The other thing is, remember, you cannot be a writer unless you're a reader. And if you're not a reader, you can't be a writer. The two go hand in hand. In fact, reading has to come first and then the writing has to come later. I'm sorry, I don't know who you are, but if you're not a reader, you have to start reading and read in the genre that you want to write in. You want to write fantasy? Read a lot of fantasy. You want to write YA? Read a lot of YA, and read the stuff that's coming out now, because the genre has changed. The expectations of the genre has changed, and you have to stay current. After that, you just have to write. It's really hard as a teacher. I used to, on my way home, when my kids were little, from picking them up from my babysitter, I would stop off at a coffee shop for about 2 or 3 times a week for 45 minutes, and I'd drink a coffee and I would write like crazy. And when my kids were at, swimming classes or taekwondo or softball or whatever, I would take my laptop and I would write. So I was that inattentive mother, but I got some writing done. And I'd get up early on the weekends and write. So you have to find the little pockets of time and then do as much as you can. I hope I answered your question. And if you have any follow-up, please feel free to ask any more questions. Who is my favorite character to write? I like the funny characters. I find them interesting. I also really, because right now I'm writing romantic comedies. I hope to write in other genres as well. But I really enjoy writing the relationship, because that's almost like a third character in romantic comedies. Like, what is, you have the protagonist, the love interest, and then the relationship between the two. So I find the tension of that is really interesting. I think this is just part of being part of a big family. I have a big extended family in Canada. I love to write like a huge cast of characters. Like I want 15 people, and I want them all to be different and interesting and witty and kind of out there and quirky. So I enjoyed those characters. In Hannah Khan Carries On, the character of Gokub, which is Hannah's aunt who came from India, will always have a very special place in my heart. I think she's amazing and funny and so wise. How has the response been on social media, and how important is it for authors today to be on top of it? Do you recommend certain platforms? So I've actually asked my publisher, my HarperCollins, about this. I'm not very good at social media. I was a very late adopter. I only joined Facebook in 2017 after everyone left Facebook. Not really. I know we're all on Facebook still. And I joined it because I was a writer, and I thought, oh, I should be accessible. I only joined Twitter in 2016 because, again, I wanted to be a published writer, and I had heard that a lot of writers congregate on Twitter, which is true. My publisher said that pick 1 or 2 platforms and do them really, really well. So I'm mostly on Twitter. I'm at Uzma Writes, if you want to follow me. And I occasionally post on Instagram. I'm at Uzma Jalaluddin on Instagram. And I think it is important to have some kind of social media presence, but it's not, people aren't necessarily going to run out and buy your books just because they follow you on Twitter. That's not the way it works. If you have, and the other thing is, you don't want to sound like an endless commercial, right, for your books, because people can tell that you're not being authentic when all you do is, the only thing you ever tweet about is your books. And you have to be a whole complete human being online in order to kind of attract people to you. So I'm probably not the right person to ask about this. I'm on Twitter. I'm not really on Facebook too much at all. And I'm on Instagram, and I'm mostly a retweeter. So maybe you should ask, a professional in the field. And I think our time is almost up. If we have any more questions, I would be happy to answer them. And if not, I'm just going to write my handles on in the chat here. So that's Twitter and at Uzma Jalaluddin on Instagram. And if you'd like to learn more about me or my books. Now I'm sounding like a commercial. My website is usmajalaldeen.com. And there's an FAQ there as well as a press kit if you have any questions about the publishing process, the getting your book option for film, all of that. I have a whole series of answers there. And I always check my email. So if you would like to email me, I will. I always read it. It might take me a couple of weeks to respond, but I usually do as well. Yeah, no problem. I'm so happy to hear that my answers were useful. And yeah, thanks for coming to this panel presentation. It was great chatting with you all. I hope I did justice to all of your questions.